so much for coming tonight to this meeting of the Capitalism Workshop. I'm excited to introduce the launch of Matt Hern's newest book, On This Patch of Grass, an in-depth examination of colonialism in public parks, the relationship between settlers and Indigenous people in the Canadian state. And I would like to begin our meeting with a land acknowledgement.
I've agreed to give a land acknowledgement. I'm gonna sit for it. I will. Okay, thank you. I'm always reminded to project. We were just sitting together and we were talking about land acknowledgement, and so from that conversation and in good spirit, I'm gonna give this my effort. And land acknowledgement is not a simple thing. It's it should be actually problematized. And so I'm going to do my job of recognizing, I'm a Great Lakes Métis. I'll introduce myself after. So I'm recognizing my own Indigenous ancestry from these lands. I want to firstly recognize Onkw'Onwe people. So those are Longhouse people, also referred to as Iroquois or Iroquois people. The Six Nation, Haudenosaunee, Mohawk, Seneca, Oneida, Onondaga, Tuscarora, and Cayuse, and other Onkw'Onwe peoples who didn't confederate but are also important peoples to recognize from these lands. And those are the Wendat, also now known as the Wyandot or the Wendake, the Petun, the Tobacco, the Erie, and the Neutral peoples who all came through these lands and who refer to these territories as their inherited traditional homelands, as well as Anishinaabe peoples. So we recognize the Three League Fire, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi who came through here. I also want to recognize Blackfoot, Delaware Lenape, Nehea Cree, and many other peoples who came through here because the Great Lakes Basin is a place of such great abundance with the merger of the boreal forest of the north and the Carolinian forest of the south, the Great Lakes, the great wetlands, lots of reasons for peoples to come through here. I want to recognize all those peoples and more. And most importantly, in this land acknowledgement, actually I also want to recognize the contemporary stewards and Mississaugas of the Credit River. And lastly, the land itself. When we make a land acknowledgement, let's please recognize the land itself and all those non-human or other than human relatives who have called this place home for time immemorial, and who thankfully some of which are still with us today, and we can still hear them. That's what I want to say. Is that okay? Anything else you want to add? Miigwech.
Thank you. That's literally the best land acknowledgement I've ever heard, so thank you. And we're hopefully going to talk a lot more about this tonight. So just before we get to introducing our speakers, a couple of words about the organizers. This workshop is built by the Socialist Project, co-sponsored by, I believe, the Center for Social Justice, I think I have that right, and the Toronto New Socialists. The Capitalism Workshop itself is an ongoing series of forums and lectures about the everything to do with capitalism and its life worlds or death worlds. As I said tonight, I'm excited to introduce the launch of Matt's newest book, which is available. We got a couple of copies on the table, I think for $30, but you may want to confirm that. I understand it's a collaborative effort, which I guess you might be talking about.
Sure.
And we're going to be following a slightly different format this evening. Rather than a speech from the front followed by more speeches from the front, I understand this will be more of a conversational effort. I'm going to ask the speakers to project as much as possible so the folks way at the back of the room can hear them, can hear you guys. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers who are, please add details and correct me on mispronunciations if I have them. So Andrea Bastien is Director of Operations at Indigenous Climate Action and part of the Indigenous Land Stewardship Circle. She's worked with organizations such as Redwire NYM, UMAYC, Indigenous Media Arts Group, and the Toronto Aboriginal Youth Council, among many, many others. I'm pulling this from your website, and there was a long list of other affiliations, which I didn't have time to mention. Among her different roles, Andrea has been a youth advocate, advisor, administrator, performer, program facilitator, and communications coordinator. Okay, moving on. Then Matt Hern. Matt lives in East Vancouver on, I did practice this, Tsleil-Waututh.
Sure, yeah, good. Yeah, Tsleil-Waututh.
Thank you. Squamish and Musqueam territory. He is currently co-directing Solid State Community Industries and has co-founded and directed many other community projects. He currently teaches with multiple universities and continues to lecture globally. Matt's books and articles have been published on all 6 continents and translated into 15 languages. And then finally, Cheryl Teelucksingh is professor of sociology at Ryerson University, whose research, where her research focuses on the relationship between environmental justice in Canada and social inequality. She publishes prolifically on environmental justice, spatial justice, and racialization, and is actively involved with several community organizations and NGOs committed to both social and environmental change.
We also have one more person to introduce, so
Thank
please,
you.
If you don't mind.
I'm going to introduce myself on account of I was invited by Andrea more recently to this conversation. I'm very honored to be a part of this conversation. My French name is Joce Tremblay. My English name is Joce Tremblay. Sego, Ani, by the way. Welcome to this space. I'm a Great Lakes Métis. I come from southwestern Ontario, so a very small community called Pointe-aux-Roches or Stony Point. I have been doing earthworking my whole life with my community, so I have Mohawk ancestry from my paternal grandmother, Potawatomi ancestry from my paternal grandfather, Mi'kmaq ancestry from my maternal grandfather, and Ashkenazi and then French mixed throughout. So I'm a hybrid, like many of us today, and I've been in Toronto now 20 years. As I said, I've been a lifelong earth worker, and that's the main reason why I'm here today. I'm also a community worker and an artist, and I work in parks because that's primarily where Indigenous folks are leveraging space, and I'm really stoked to talk with you folks today. I really am. And I'm going to fully disclose, I'm a two-spirit trans person, and I'm going to embody that reality for myself today, I should say.
Beautiful.
So, in a moment, I'm going to join the crowd and cede the floor. I was hoping, Matt, maybe you could just kick things off with a bit of an intro to your research project, and then everyone can join in, and we'll have about 45 minutes for discussion, more or less.
Great. Absolutely. And I totally like that hope, but actually, Cheryl's going to start.
Oh.
Yeah. If you don't mind, that's all right.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, okay. I'm at Ryerson, and I do work around environmental sociology, but particularly looking at how race and class and indigeneity and our identities are important in terms of environmental spaces. And when I was taking a look at Matt's book, one of the things that really sort of made the connection to other work that I'm doing is the sense by which land is inscribed with race and with colonialism and with privilege. And what we thought would be really sort of helpful is to make some connections to things that Matt talks about in his book, as well as things that are happening here in Toronto. So as we all know, in Toronto there's so much urban development going on. And everywhere you turn around, condos now are almost sort of replacing trees. And this big initiative is often this sense of doing good by sort of putting in green spaces wherever you can. So the green spaces are sometimes an afterthought. So they appear on top of buildings or small sort of patches. So one of the things I was thinking about as in conversation with Matt was to talk about how nature and nature in cities is sometimes an afterthought, and how nature in cities creates this interesting tension between public and private spaces, and to think about it that way. And one of the places that have been fairly important to me that I think others here are also going to talk about is High Park, and how a lot of us engage with High Park, but we know that there's certain activities and certain people who are seen to have a greater claim to High Park and a better sense of belonging. So hopefully that'll sort of kick off some of our discussion.
Nice. One of you guys want to go next? Say something about yourselves and your work?
Sure, I can go ahead. So Oki anin tanse Andrea Bastien Indigenous Siksika Amiskapi Pakani Anishinaabe Nahia Donjiba. I live here in Toronto. I'm originally hailing from Coast Salish territories. My family is from Montana, and we're Blackfoot Ojibwe and Cree. But I am the Director of Operations at Indigenous Climate Action, and we are so-called Canada's premier Indigenous-led climate justice organization. And so on the peripheral of that work, I've become involved with a group called the Indigenous Land Stewardship Circle, of which I work with Joce as well. And we are a group of volunteers that are pushing back on some of the chemical uses to control so-called invasive species in public parks. And so specifically the High Park issue came up because we are focused on pushing back on the Garland RTU use, which became the new chemical that is sprayed just before the holidays started, due to the fact that our circle called for a moratorium on the Bayer Monsanto use of Roundup. So that is just a little snapshot of where I come from and what I do, and that'll become part of our conversation.
Okay, so as I said, I'm an earth worker, which is not necessarily a commonly used term. I've been a farmer, I've been a gardener, I've been engaged in landscaping practices, and none of those titles work for me personally. I prefer to work with the land and to work with the relatives on the land, as my teachings where I come from are about. And I have been working in Indigenous community clear across the city and beyond. I'm a seed keeper of traditional tribal seeds, and so I have a very important vested responsibility to share the stories of those seeds and share the teachings and the practices for how to grow those heritage seeds. They're very rare. And that's some of our traditional foods and medicines, but also to practice traditional growing using ceremony, and especially to be practicing regulations. And I've been working in High Park with Diagon Historical Preservation Society, which is a group doing work to protect and preserve the sacred mounds in High Park. I've worked with a number of different Indigenous organizations to do land-based stuff along the Humber River, along the Rouge, along the Don, and in many different parks, and some with permission and some without, which is something we were talking about earlier. Permission is a very interesting concept. And for me, I just wanted to convey that, like, the most important thing to share in this process is just actually how we do the work and how we're going to continue to do it, and having the opportunity to talk with someone who is doing work on the other side of the country, but nonetheless, like, I've been reading stuff that comes from the West Coast, like Park People recently published an article from an Indigenous woman just talking about how we need to re-indigenize these green spaces. So part and parcel with decolonizing is re-indigenizing, and how important it is to do that with Indigenous people and not for them. And anyways, yeah. That's what I Thank you.
Well, I'm going to say just a couple things, and I'm super happy to be here, and thanks Greg and other Greg, and thanks to Tanner, who is not here because they busted their foot up, for inviting us. So thank you so much for that, and thanks to everybody at a different book list too, who's set up the chairs and make it possible and keep this lovely space available for us. So thanks to all of you, and thanks to these good folks for being here. That's super nice. It's like I'm super happy to be here and to talk about this book, but I'm way happier to have them up here with me for your sake, but for my sake as well, because it's much nicer to be in conversation, because I'm kind of shy by nature anyway. So, but it's really nice to be able to hang out with these folks and to be able to have a conversation. And so I'm going to say just a little something about the book, and then maybe we can pick it up after that and see where we can go, and talk about these good folks work in the city here. So my name's Matt, and I am a fourth generation settler on Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh traditional unceded and occupied territory. My great grandfather got to the West Coast via the shipping trade. He was a ship captain. He settled in North Vancouver. And then most of my family ended up on Vancouver Island, and I was brought up and raised in Sachem territory. And I have a land acknowledgement that I worked on a little bit for here. And after having some conversation today, I realize how completely, totally inadequate it is, for all kinds of reasons. So I would like to acknowledge the territory that we're on here. And I do know, in some ways, that the Mississaugas of New Credit, Anishinaabe, Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, the Wendat people, are certainly have been through this territory, used this territory, consider this territory part of theirs. But there, as Joce was just speaking, there's many other folks who've been through here in many ways, and there's many other folks who continue to use this land. And as well as its indigenous inhabitants, there's also a whole raft of other people that have arrived on these in this territory. Many of us arrived of our own volition, and many other folks who arrived here without their permission. And so I just want to say thanks. Thank you to all those folks for having us here, and in particular for having me here as a visitor here. So I'm real grateful to be on this territory. As well, I also should point out, as Greg said, that I'm here representing this book, but I am very surely not the only author. It's written with my partner, Selena, and our two biological daughters, Daisy and Sadie Couture. We have lots of non-biological children, but also it's got contributions by Denise Ferreira da Silva, Glenn Coulthard, and some illustrations were done by a friend of ours called Eric Villagomez. So the book has got a whole bunch of different voices in it. And if you hear something today about the book that's good, that you like, those are the parts that I wrote. If there's other parts in there that are not so good, those are probably like one of my children or something. That's somebody else's part. We have lived, we have rented one house in East Vancouver for the last 23 years. And before that, we lived on this park. This one house is right on this one park. And before that, we lived just basically on the other side of the park. And before that, we lived a block away. And before that, we lived another block away the other way. So this one single park. It's called on the map. It's called Victoria Park. To everybody in the neighborhood, it's called Bocce Ball Park because there's a bunch of old Italian guys playing bocce and yelling at each other all the time in the park. This park has been a very intimate part of our lives for a very long time. I can see the park. We don't actually live right on the park. We're just down a little bit, but I can see the park from our kitchen window. I can smell people smoking dope in the park all the time. I can hear people arguing in the park. We walk through the park all the time. The kids were, half brought up in the park. We have a very intimate relationship with that piece of land over the course of basically my whole adult life. And in many ways, I'm interested in parks. I'm interested in parks for a whole variety of reasons. But in part, in all honesty, the book is kind of a reason to do something together as a family. And so we wrote an introduction all together, and then I wrote an essay, and Selena wrote an essay, and Sadie, who is 28 now, she took photos and did interviews with a whole bunch of park users, folks who are in the park for a whole variety of reasons. And then our youngest kid, Daisy, she took a picture from the same corner of the park every day for a year. So to try to track its kind of changes. So she stood in the same corner and faced the same way and took a picture for a year. And then we all worked on the text together in a variety of ways, shaping it and kind of molding it. So. And then, like I say, Denise wrote an introduction called The Colonial Resident Question, because she's a good pal and somebody we admire tremendously. And similarly for Glenn, is one of our closest pals and somebody whose writing we just admire tremendously. So he wrote an outro, and then we got some photos. So the book has not only those authors, but also has a whole bunch of people who are interviewed in it. So in some ways, I think maybe intentionally, the structure of the book tries to reflect the experience of the park, because it's an incredibly complicated place. You could come to Vancouver, 20 times and never go to this park. It's a totally unremarkable park. It's just one square block. It's got some bocce runs, a playground on one side, a bathroom, and a thing running through it. You could walk past it and not notice it at all. In other ways, it's a totally remarkable park in lots of ways, because there's such a dense concentration of users. There's all kinds of people who use that park for all kinds of reasons. There's people who sleep over in the park, there's people who drink in the park, there's people who use various kinds of drugs in the park, there's a bunch of kind of middle class parents who hang out at the playground, there's the bocce guys in this corner, there's the Latinx harm reduction group who's there almost every day. There's a whole variety of people in there, and they interact relatively peaceably. You know, the hipster kids doing the hipster things, and the dog people doing their dog things, and people generally speaking, interact pretty well together. There's, you know, occasionally, especially in the early days, it was a little bit hairy here and there, but basically there's a wide diversity of people using that park for a whole wide variety of reasons. And in some ways, I think it's really interesting and a very kind of rich place to think about occupation. And when I say occupation, I mean the way that we use spaces together, and the way those kinds of shifting relationships and shifting sovereignties, who thinks they have control over the park. I think all of it's very interesting in some ways. In another way to think about occupation, and the subtitle of the book is City Parks on Occupied Territory, is that of course that is unceded Indigenous territory, and that we are all occupying the park. All of us settlers are occupying the park in a wholly different sense of the word. And we are occupying the park like squatters, like the squatting residents that we are. And so to try to come to grips with that, but also I'm really interested in arguments around commonality, which is to say that I'm extraordinarily critical of commons discourses. And I tend to think that they tend to whitewash all kinds of other kinds of political ramifications of territory. And so that in many ways the heart of that book is to try to think through the occupation of land, and to think through what that might look like in a colonial context, and to think through the uses of parks, because very often people talk about parks as an unqualified good. People are their common spaces, they're places where people can engage nature, and people are, in my experience anyways, habitually uncritical about the uses and the deployments of parks. And in fact, in most, maybe all parts of the world, parks are seen as apparatuses of colonial occupation. And I'm really curious to be able to think through that, and to be able to think through what that might mean for settlers like me, but also to think through how parks, in my experience, and certainly in my part of the world, are very aggressively performing whiteness on a regular basis, and how parks are in fact are in Canada at least, and it's as far as I feel qualified to speak, that parks are always part of the colonial project. And so the book is to try to interrogate that from a variety of different perspectives, and to try to think it through as clearly as we could, which suffice to say is only marginally clearly. So that's kind of the introduction to the book. And just even starting to talk about it a little bit with these folks, with Cheryl over a couple of days, and these folks about to think about it, it's clear both how I even after the book's been out, it's not really a launch, the book's been out for a year, I feel really proud of it actually. I like a lot of what we did, and I'm also very clear about how much we missed and how much we didn't see. That part is also clear. I mean, it's clear for anything we write. It's, you know, like after you write something, you're like, oh geez, you know, I forgot about that, I forgot about this. But it's really clear to me that even in brief conversation, how much these folks have to talk about. In particular, they all have real experience in many parks, but in particular High Park, which is something I'm now super interested in. So I'm hoping that we can just pick that up, and maybe you can pick it up from wherever you like.
Okay. So if you don't mind, if I continue to put you a little on the hot seat, one of the most compelling parts of the book to me is that, yes, one of the most compelling parts of the book for me is that there's one point where you're stopped by an older Indigenous woman who asks you to go home, and you're kind of taken back by that. But I think what was really sort of important for me in terms of reading that is that your identity was directly being called into play, and you struggled a little bit about how best to respond to her. So if you were to get that, and you talk a little bit about how you ran that through your mind for the rest of the day, having had a lot more time now to reflect back on it, how would you respond to that?
Well, when you say struggle a little bit, that's super generous of you. So I'll just speak to it just very briefly, and then we can. It's actually the story that I tell to open my chapter, which is that I was walking through the park one day, spaced out. It was early on a Saturday morning, and it was really nice outside, and I wasn't paying any attention. And an older Indigenous woman just got right in front of me, and she said, "Listen, like, white boy, go home. We don't want you here. This is not your place. I don't know where your people are, but go home." And I didn't know what to do. I just stood there, and I was like, because the core argument I agree with, and to a certain extent, I was like, yeah, and so I just stood there, and I honestly thought, and I probably, if it had lasted a little bit longer, I thought she was going to spit on me. And then a guy who I didn't know this woman, by the way. And then there was one of her companions, which is a guy I sort of knew. He kind of got up and sort of held her by the arm and said, sort of like, the guy's all right, just kind of let him be. And as she went by, she just kind of bumped me and looked at me, and I was like, all right. And of course, like, her claim was substantially correct. And so the honest truth is, I'm not super certain about my heritage all the way. I'm mostly Irish. But there's like a bunch of Scottish and French and other kind of just mongrelly white person stuff in there, and I'm not nearly as fluent as I would probably should be or would like to be, and so I just thought, I kept on thinking about that, about what, like, how to adequately think about that, and the real answer is that I don't really have a great answer to it right now, except that I spend my days. I'm a community organizer, so I spend my days with newcomer kids, mostly Middle Eastern and African kids, and that's a complicated claim to think about that. And it's just the clear unclarity of that, because while I'm not certainly clear about my background, what I do know is that I'm a white person, and that my presence is corrosive, and that I carry in all my fabric. I carry my colonial heritage with me, and so that's the opening part of the book, is to say that's that, and that's a thing that I'm thinking about, and to try to think through, and I think it's something to do with land acknowledgement as well. I think there's a pivot in there, which is to say, then what then? Like, what is that land acknowledgement? And when we acknowledge the territory, when I acknowledge territory, okay, fine, sure, but what might that actually mean, and what might my presence here mean? So
that opening was also really striking to me, to speak to this elder Indigenous woman telling you to go home. I thought that it's honest, and also it's really poignant, and it strikes anybody who reads it too. We should all actually be asking ourselves that question, myself included. I mean, I'm literally the battleground of colonization, and that is my own identity politics to negotiate with every step. Like, I am easily misperceived as a white man, whilst I am neither of those wholly and truly. And so identity is obviously very complicated. And how we relate to the land through identity, for me, spirit is how I most strongly relate to the land, and that's often completely left out of the colonial engagement with the land. In fact, some of what I found interesting in your book, where you're talking about a particular time where nature, and bringing nature into the city to pacify the people during this industrial era, make it soft and nice and beautify, what have you. And my experience has been so the opposite, that nature has been cast as like the villain, has been demonized as dirty, as evil, as demonic, as witchy, and all these things that you should be afraid of, and thusly we should turn our backs. And in growing up on the land, and where my parents are the only two from their huge families, one of 14 and one of 10, who stayed connected to the land, and also who retained connection to their indigeneity, and that's inseparable to me. But so much stigma cast on them that they were dirty, somehow unintelligent, or their intelligence was debased because of being connected to the land, whilst in fact their intelligence or their body of knowledge is just so vast. And now a privilege, it's rare to hold that kind of knowledge tied to the land. In fact, it's I rarely encounter anybody my age who has grown up with that kind of relationship to the land. So to say, I really enjoyed the interviews, specifically the interviews by those Indigenous folks and those street-involved Indigenous folks. And that was a piece that I really thought, I want to speak to that, because that's my lived experience here in Toronto too, as having been street-involved and in working with street-involved folks, that we're in a colonial mindset. We misperceive the freedom of movement, which was like a thing for all of our Indigenous peoples. There was no such thing as borders and boundaries. People moved freely. And the imposition of property and these boundaries laid up on land, and that you trespass everywhere you go. If you try to walk in a straight line anywhere, and actually I'm not very invested in straight lines at all, but if you just try to walk in a direction, let's say east or west, you're constantly being, like, coming up against barriers, which, like, intellectually, but physically and spiritually and emotionally, I see as the literal vestiges of genocide, of cultural genocide. That when you cannot move freely, and thus you cannot have relationships, like, I can't just go to the Humber River of my own. I have to follow a route that's been delineated for me, and so I don't have self-determination or choice in that. And even just to go to the Humber River, be on the Humber River, the whole shoreline has been just completely, every green space, as you articulate in the book, has been manufactured, has been constructed. There's generation upon generation of displacement of all the relatives and disturbance. And so, like, when we talk about invasives at High Park, and we're trying to actually decolonize and re-indigenize the way we talk about invasive species, and like actually how you talk about in your book also, our resident species or what have you, they're not invasive. In fact, they're contributing a lot. They're indicators. They're volunteers to hold the soil in place, and they're there because the land was displaced. Anywhere you see a plant that's been called invasive or noxious, it is showing us the land was disturbed, and probably it's been disturbed. It's continuously being disturbed, and that's why it's there. It's there because no other relatives, especially the more sensitive ones, can be there. And so to continue to disturb the land manually or chemically only further exacerbates the problem and shows just our total ignorance of actual soil biology and how to support life from the ground or otherwise. And so just so many things are turning in my head right now, actually, just about that one piece, this woman coming forward and saying, go home, you shouldn't be here. It's an important problematic question.
Yeah, and I mean, when we think about, like, the point of contact, you know, part of the way these places were taken over were to take over the spaces that we were using. You know, Spadina being one of the main trade routes, and, you know, of course, that was one of the first places that were taken over, so that we were automatically taken away from our personal realities. Now, you know, I am Anishinaabe, but my family, again, is from Montana, so Siksika. Clearly we access this territory, and I'm not as familiar with it. But that doesn't mean that those relatives that have now been dwindling, you know, in those areas, you know, the deer, the waterways that have been dried up, like, they're all indicators, right? And so when I think about green space in cities, I think about first that is the taking over of space. And then next, when I think about green space, because my context of growing up in Vancouver on Coast Salish territories, my experience was that any new green space that came about was because it needed to be renaturalized because of toxins, right? And so when Gastown was being built up, what is the park beside Roundhouse called? Allen, can't remember.
The one right in the water there?
The one right by the water.
Yeah.
So when it was first created, it was created because there were so many toxins and heavy metals in that area that they turned it into a park and a playground. And I was a teenager at that point, right, living right downtown. And I'd accessed the park when it was first created, and I kept coming home with rashes on me. And so I think about that, like, violent kind of takeover of imagining, like, it almost felt like a wonderland of, like, we'll just pretend that stuff doesn't exist, that this area is not toxic, and we're going to put this playground on top so that it looks like it's a safe place to be, where in fact it's actually quite violent. And so I think segueing back into Toronto and High Park, this is something that Joce and I talk about every once in a while, because it is true that violence on the land begets violence on our women. And I think about High Park, and that the female species of trees are no longer there because they're too messy or they drop things. They need more care. And to me, that's a direct reflection of the human species, where because women, we are socialized or in mainstream Western constructs of our societies, we're looked upon as, well, we bleed, so we're dirty. We drop things, right? We're emotionally messy, or we're all of these things. So how far can we actually sculpt these spaces to appease our eye? What is beauty, right? And in High Park, you know, we have all these visitor species that are apparently a danger to the oak savanna, which is an Indigenous space that no longer is being caretaken by Indigenous people. Now the UN, the United Body, the United Nations, is stating that Indigenous stewardship is a key solution to our climate crisis problem, right? The UN body is asking for a halt for all of these huge infrastructures of industry, pipelines, and all of these things. So where does that reflection then turn to our visibility in actually caretaking these lands, right? That woman saying for you to go home, maybe she wouldn't have said that if you were participating, as opposed to, and she doesn't know your reality, right? So she doesn't know where you're at. But if there was more involvement, right? And so, you know, every once in a while I'm invited to speak on different panels or at different events, and I think a key question that I keep being asked is like, well, how do we get involved? Like, how do we know what's going on, and how do we participate? And it's like, well, how do you access this land? Where do you access this land? What do you know about the Indigenous peoples of this land? And where do you meet them where they are at? Because we continually are being asked to come to all of these other conversations and all of these other tables, but rarely does anybody come to us. So it's kind of the segue that I felt about. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because you have a lot of experience in Hyde Park.
Yeah, but some of my experience was in terms of doing research. So I did research in the Parkdale area, and they were very much sort of taken up with the concerns around gentrification and how that was sort of playing out in the Parkdale area. But I also had a really sort of strong sense that if you think about the park as a geographical space, there was a big difference between the affluence in High Park and in Bloor West Village versus the folks in Parkdale. But they were all part of the same municipal political area. So it became really difficult for people trying to represent the area to speak to both of the concerns, and then to think about the community practically coming together within Hyde Park. And there was a lot of tension. So discussions around things were often shifted to talking about park benches and what park benches should structurally look like. So they shouldn't be longer park benches where multiple people could sit fairly closely together, have a discussion or whatever, but to bring in the park benches that had the dividing line so that someone couldn't sleep on the park bench. Or in some places in Parkdale, they were beginning to take out park benches. So that the park itself became an interesting way to look at those sort of political tensions and to see how different groups were trying to work together to make the city a place that different people belong in. Part of what I started to also think about in relationship to Toronto, but also Matt's work and his family's work, was how do we do it differently, right? If we're all participating in this, so even newcomers. So my parents came here to study and never went back in terms of coming to Canada. But I appreciate the fact that I'm also implicated then in the settler colonial project as a second generation person. So how should my people, other immigrants, also sort of think about engaging in parks place and city building and that sort of thing in a very different sort of way. So that's some of the discussion that you start to ask questions and problematize that I think would be really good to sort of talk about a little bit more.
Yeah. But you guys have a bunch of like other work going on in Hyde Park too.
Actually, I want to touch on a really important, we were talking about placemaking. It's a catch term right now. I was thinking previously, I wanted to recognize that that idea actually was generated here in Toronto. There's been decades of really important work that Indigenous community have done for their own communities, and it takes years, of course, for it to actually get picked up. But I know from my own research that much of that work has been adopted by the city. There's publicly facing documentation where they've endorsed it or that what have you. They recognize that work, but moving that theory to practice is a whole other thing, of course. But I want to recognize actually the precedence that was set by the report on the inquiry into missing murdered Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQ plus peoples, which is that, as Andrea was talking about, violence on the land is echoed on violence, in the violence that comes down onto our human people carrying the divine feminine. So women, girls, two-spirit trans women, but I was saying over dinner, we can see that in dairy cows, we can see that in egg-laying chickens, we can see that in female trees. And so there's like a much broader decolonial process to look at what it means to be Indigenous and to be not safe. So cultural safety is a really big piece of this placemaking conversation. And it was generated specifically by Two-Spirit youth coming from Nishin, the Native Youth Sexual Health Network. And they were working with the Women's Environmental Alliance to talk about violence on the land and violence on our bodies. And they were talking about placemaking because they're saying, and this was picked up again by the report, and it's made very clear. In fact, Blue Waters, who is a Two-Spirit elder, our elder here, and who was an elder and grandmother who did healing work all across the city, or rather the country, the so-called nation state of Canada, in the process of this inquiry to make sure that people were emotionally taken care of in their grief, that placemaking is about allowing those people who have been pushed most to the margin, who have been systemically vulnerabilized. They're not vulnerable, they're powerful as shoot, but they've been vulnerabilized. To allow them to create the places for themselves. More than a space that's just maybe once a month or even once a week for 3 hours, but place that's there for them always, that they can go back to, that the energy isn't all stirred up by other people's purposes, that it's there for them and that they created it. Nobody did it for them, they did it for themselves as a community, and that is a really important piece for us to recognize here on these lands in Toronto, that Two-Spirit people have been contributing to that, and they've made it very clear that that placemaking has to be tied to the land. And that's also not a specific, just a Two-Spirit piece. That's coming from all across the nation state of Canada too, and for decades where our people are saying, we're not saying move out of your house or give us your house, because that's often a reaction to like, well, what am I supposed to do about reconciliation? We're not saying we want your houses. That's not what we're saying. But we would like to have restored connection to the land so we can do ceremonies, so we can harvest. There's so many things that needs to happen with our restored connection to the land. And to touch on this piece that Andrea brought forward, which is the UN is recognizing how important it is for Indigenous people to be at the center, not just like included off to the side after conversations were already started, but at the center, at the beginning of conversations around climate change. Indigenous people need to be there because they have a deep and inseparable sense of the land. And what I really mean by that is that rather than us coming in with a predetermined way of dealing with a problem on the land, that we actually make space for the relatives on the land to speak for themselves, because they too are sovereign and self-determined. And that's what our ceremonies are for. Our ceremonies are for us to connect to our other relatives. We go in the sweat lodge and we get visions from our ancestors, the Elder Rocks. We get visions from our clans. I get visions from Beaver every time I go into sweat lodge. We get visions from the relatives we're trying to work with for a reason. They help guide our purpose. That, to me, is my understanding from Anishinaabe teachings of Bimatsuin, the good way. To be in right relations is to be as many steps that we take every day, thinking about regenerative reciprocity, and that comes from Anishinaabe knowledge as well. That we want not just to like be pals, like over the water fountain, but that we show up for each other. Like I call Andrea at home. I know about Andrea's grief. I'm walking, holding Andrea's grief because I want to be in right relations with this Niji, as an example. So I like to put this forward in my work, whether I'm working with wee ones or elders from whatever class bracket. More often than not, I prefer to work with folks who are like lower income and who don't have as much access. They don't have front yards or backyards or neighborhoods where they can easily access the land. But that thinking about right relations, so kids pick this up really easy because they're close to spirit. We're going to harvest some cedar. So like any friendship, the first thing you do is introduce yourself. So imagine that Andrea is a cedar tree what lovely cedar tree, indeed. If I was going to come and harvest from Andrea, and I'd say, like, Andrea's glasses are the branch of cedar that I want to take, I wouldn't just rip them off Andrea's face. We would understand that that's not, like, a good ethic. That the least I should do is form a relationship first. Hi, my name is la la la. Oh, that's a nicer name. I really like your glasses. Could I just take a look at them? And before I take them, I listen and I honor consent, which is a really critical part of right relations that just doesn't get carried forward often in the way that we harvest or just make production from the land. And that's also why I don't identify with farming or gardening or any kind of mode that actually thinks of the land not in that kind of relationship building, which is that we have to honor, which takes a lot of time to listen. And so when we are dependent on paying mortgages and property taxes and all that stuff, it ties us in a system where we continue to extract from the land and not give that time and space to honor those relationships. And that's just inherently a problem with the system of, I decided to unveil this shirt. It's a little bit cutting. I don't know if you can see that, but I have to say.
Land from the terrorists
of
private property.
Yeah. What I really mean to say is that this comes from abolitionist theory. None of us are free until all of us are free from prisons, right? But where the land is held hostage under property, no relative is free. Not a plant, not a stone, not a river, not a bird, not a fish, not a deer, not a squirrel is free. And so neither is a human relative free. And it's also a fairly problematic way of thinking about how we are on the land. But writing relations is not just something we do with human people or Indigenous people. Often in the conversations currently where we're talking about right relations, it's misperceived that it's just about human people. But if you think about all the hundreds of thousands of relationships that we are missing out on with all those other relatives, even in the city, even in a city park that is mostly just grass and a few, well-placed trees, there's all these microorganisms, there's plants mixed in with that sod, there's any number of fungal relationships on any single tree that we could be sharing space with and listening to and learning from, and perhaps having a completely different way of understanding how to be in the world. Like, it might induce a paradigm shift. I believe my elders in that teaching, I have to say.
Yeah. And when we think about Indigenous peoples as a direct solution to our climate crisis, that's also kind of a dangerous phrase to just be tossing out into the world without really understanding what that means. Because I think what people fail to recognize is that our communities haven't even necessarily had the space to reconnect with ourselves, let alone how we are in relation with everyone else. And when I think about the colonization of the Americas, specifically the United States, because we're so influenced by that culture, I think about how Sigmund Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays, was key in the manipulation of consent and the way that those principles of psychology were embedded in the American population to become an individual. And so when we think about all of these systems that we're being disconnected from our biodiversity is because we're being put into smaller and smaller check boxes, essentially, that are really a huge construct from someone whose history is actually quite questionable, in my opinion, at any rate. But when we think about any type of capitalism, this is a huge, spark to that system. And we've come so far from it that we don't recognize that we're being pulled from our own biodiversity. From you. I don't know you. I don't know you. I know you, thankfully. I know someone here. I know Kim. But we don't know each other, right? And these are the relationships that we're trying to heal and reconcile in some ways. And yet those who have been impacted first and foremost by genocide, we have not had the time to recover ourselves. And now we've been asked to be at the forefront of climate solutions to save the whole world, because though we represent 5% of the global population and sit on 22% of land mass and 80% of the world's biodiversity, we're all disconnected enough in our individual mind state that we can't see our neighbors. And that's what a park should be able to do in a lot of ways. It's a gathering space, it's a meeting space, it's for us to have fellowship and be together. Yet when we go to these spaces and we access them, we're still alone in our individual families, or with our dogs, or with our book, or the water. Maybe we're there to visit the birds, right? But we are not really having true fellowship and building relationships with each other, because we've been indoctrinated with this manufacturing of consent, which means I am the most important. And so we're breaking down our own biodiversity by turning our back to that and not reconnecting with each other and our relatives, all of the pieces of biodiversity that make us what we are, which to me leads to the fact that it's really dangerous for us to be sculpting, as Joce said, like let nature talk to us, let it grow back and speak to us in a way that we can understand what it needs in order for us to be able to be in better relation, because without that, we're just doing the same thing. We're killing those so-called invasive species. We're oppressing nature to this point where we're poisoning our own selves. Not necessarily even just with the chemicals that we're using to control, but it's a minds. It's a construct that we really need to break out of in our own minds, because we've come so far from what relations are about that we can't even see the forest through the trees.
That first little story I tell to open my little chapter is kind of like I do it hesitantly in some ways, because what's kind of key, and I kind of try to write about this some, is like the least important part of that story, and like is the part that to try to kind of steer away from is like the kind of white fragility or the white guilt part of that, right? Which is like, actually, I don't have any interest in parsing my own emotional contours about that scenario particularly, much less anybody else does, right? And so part of what's really interesting to me is that the next, cause I actually skipped to the, okay, what next thing also in my thinking, and I was like, oh, okay, well then, if that land was stolen, then the right thing to do is to give it back. Because immediately our friend Leanne has this great little line where she talks about, she uses it, you probably know Leanne Simpson's work, and she has this thing about like, she says, like under Canadian law, if you steal a car, and even if if you have that car for a while, you have to give it back. And even if you have that car for a long time, and even if you really like it, and even if it's really important to your life, and even if you've gotten really attached to that car, if you get caught, you have to give that back. And so I was like, oh, okay. So then why not just give that land back? And this is kind of emerged, I think this is speaking to your relationality thing, and it's like, that's actually a really facile kind of way to think about it in a lot of ways. And there's somebody who, if you get to encounter, Irina Sutar, she's the Indigenous parks planner. She's the first Indigenous parks planner in Vancouver, and she's wonderful. And she's just was like we were talking through this, and she's like that's actually like one more imposition, right? Like the last thing Squamish or Musqueam or Tsleil-Waututh needs is responsibility for another park. When capacity, they're already like struggling with capacity in all kinds of ways, right? Like it's not the relational aspect of that is like it's not like that kind of, you can't exculpate like 150 years of colonial occupation. Like, okay, here, just have it. That's a simplistic way to think about it, and doesn't speak to any kind of relational kind of way to think about it. Okay, what would that mean? What is your life like? What would it look like if I just like to an already like heavily taxed like stretched set of administrators to say, oh, here's another job for you. We cool now, right? And I was just when you're thinking about, I can't remember what you said exactly, but something about that was made me think about a lot of the way Rena talks about that, and about how Rena's job as the Indigenous planner is somehow that she's just constantly people are coming to her over and over and over again for her like kind of blessings, and she's like, well, hang on for a second, just give me a second. You spoke about time, right? You both spoke about time really nicely, right? It's just like, just give me a second here. Like, this is going to take time to think this through and to think about it. It's not just a simple matter of some kind of transactional relationship. Okay, great. Now it's yours. We're all good now, right? That thing I did. So I think we thought about that. We talked about that a lot the other day. About that is like that like next step is like extraordinarily complicated in lots of ways, right? It's like and I think the piece that you said several times there is that to think through that relationality of that. Like, what does that? It's not a transactional relationship. There's something else there.
Or what it means to be stewards with Indigenous people, which I think was part of what you were talking about.
I think, thank you for bringing up stewardship, because I feel like a really big consideration for High Park as a response to like chemical and mechanical processes for dealing with, again, a legacy of disturbance and what happens to the land in those circumstances. And where especially, like, there's actually so much evidence that shows that continuing to add chemicals only worsens the problem. So that's one of the things that the Indigenous Stewardship Circle is trying to address. And the circle used to call itself the Sovereignty Circle, and then we realized actually that stewardship is kind of at the heart of what we want to talk about. And that stewardship is a nation-and-nation responsibility. And that, in fact, separate work that I'm doing with Diagon Historical Preservation Society and the Nature Center at High Park is to try and create a stewardship project to support Indigenous people to be able to return into High Park. Rather, I shouldn't say return, because they never left. They've been there, probably in your work too, you've seen, and you kind of touched on this. The neighborhoods around High Park, whilst there's been a lot of affluence, I have to point out that Wendigo Way, which is a street on the west side, like Wendigo in Anishinaabe traditions is like, it's a spirit that basically corrupts your soul, and it drags you away, and it's like Wendigo comes for you when you are not in right relations. So it is hilarious to live on Wendigo Way, just saying. But it shows that they just didn't understand about Wendigo, actually.
Yeah.
And I mean, High Park is surrounded with Algonquin Road and Indian Grove and Indian Grove Crescent, Indian Trail. There's a lot of indicators in a very colonial way of there having been indigeneity there. But if you go into High Park, you will see almost virtually nothing that contemporarily we now associate with Indigenous visibility. So that might look in people's minds like a medicine wheel or a dream catcher or feathers. Those are the things that tell Indigenous people this is a service for you. There's none of those things, nor is there any mention but one suggestive a possibility of Indigenous engagement with High Park historically. Otherwise, it's pretty much fairly sanitized, whitewashed. All the different departments, from the zoo with our buffalo to the Colborne Lodge Historical Site, to of course all the athletic complexes. Nothing in the park acknowledges Indigenous history, and there is little. Their only mention is from the High Park stewards. Okay, who work in the greenhouse to essentially start from seed native plants that they put into the park, and they also sell into the Toronto communities. The stewards make a possible, like I mentioned, that suggests there's a potential of Indigenous engagement. They understand that the oak savanna is rare and it's special and it's important, and they've designated it a Nancy site, but they've just really missed the mark on why or how. And so the stewardship piece, just to come back to it, it's the response to using chemicals is engaging people again. So chemicals are used because it's faster. It's not even easier, because again, it only exacerbates the problem. But wherein human people aren't doing the stewardship anymore as they used to. More people need to be on the land with their hands in the ground, relating to plants, making that time. Like I think of the small economy sort of put forward this idea that like people could work less and spend more time on the land with their families and friends relating to each other. But we'd have to work less. Could we do that? I don't think people will let go of their jobs to do that. But you know what? Yeah. So just putting it out there that stewardship is actually, it's not just Indigenous people's work. Indigenous people should be at the forefront of stewardship work, absolutely, especially because they've been pushed out of that work largely. They should be recentered in that work. But that's nation-to-nation work. Like for anybody who wants to know, what does it mean to be a treaty person? How do I get into right relations with Indigenous people, or better yet, with Indigenous relatives of any kind, not just the human ones on these lands, is to re-engage in stewardship. So wherein absolutely there's lots of evidence that like nature therapy is really good when you have nature deficit disorder and what have you. It's good to get close to the natural world. But these landscapes that we see, aka parks, are totally manufactured. Again, you speak to that, we all recognize that. Probably everybody understands that one way or another. They're fairly homogenous, heteronormative. They position people in very narrow roles in terms of how to interact with the land. I mean, there's a piece there where we're talking about the bylaws. and how they contradict each other. And it's like, don't sit, don't stand, don't walk, don't breathe, don't even do anything here. So, which is a great site of contestation, because everything you do then is problematizing that space, and that's exciting and juicy. And so the more we jump into that and challenge that, and just literally putting our hands in the earth, because I really do believe, like from my lived experience, that colonization has been about severing our relationship from the natural world, like true wild. Nature is just such a manufactured word even. Like what is nature or natural is very constructed. I think about greenwash, like the other day, just bear with me on this. The other day I saw this advertisement on YouTube that came up, and I was like, oh, I guess this is like one of those Facebook mechanisms that's like targeted me as I'm into eco stuff. And it's like laundry detergent bottles, they are filling landfills. They could be recycled, but only 1 in 5 are actually being recycled. So you should buy this product that is in a non-recyclable plastic, and it's literally just a gimmick. It's like a strip of gum that's dehydrated laundry detergent, and it's like, it's got that total greenwash aesthetic. It's like the kind of soft edges, and there's white people wearing sweaters, walking through a park. And I was like, they don't even mention if that product is like environmentally sound or anything, but people are gonna go and buy it just because they're saying, the bottles are bad. But you could have recycled it, is the point. So the idea of like decolonizing our relationship to parks, including like making our relationship to those spaces radically different. Like I really love like arts in the park. I really love where anybody actually tries to like shift the way in which we engage with the park, with or without permission. Because again, I think about waiting for a year to get permission on something. It would be really hard to hold on to a project as an Indigenous person if you're waiting for the state to give you that I just think of that father figure who is like, even if you get straight A's, they still say it's not good enough, and you're just like, shoot. So like, if we're trying to get permission to have a sacred fire, okay? And this again comes from the experience. This past year, we grew a garden out on the Humber River. It was part of a legacy of Two-Spirit work and ceremony. It was like supported by elders. We were given permission. We were following the protocols of Unqualified and Anishinaabe teachings on these lands. And we planted this garden of traditional foods from there. We were rematriating. So repatriation, for anybody who doesn't know, is when the people are given back their seeds from institutions. Rematriation is bringing the seeds back to the land where they come from. So to return the seeds to where they come from is to separate it. It's not the people's seeds, it's the land seeds, okay? So we were rematriating seeds that came from the Humber River, specifically from Diagon, which is a Mohawk Seneca Wendat village that is in what is now called Babby Point, which is named after a general who slaughtered actually all those people and built illegally on top of their homes or on top of their village. So in honor of the spirits of those peoples and in honor of a legacy of ceremony, we planted these 3 sisters, and they ended up being destroyed in a miscommunication by the city and people who mow the grass. And this happened 3 days after the report, the MMIW report came out, and we had been reading it in Two-Spirit community together, because we recognize it's triggering. There's a lot of grief that comes up because it's a lot of our people that we've seen go. So when our sisters, those relatives, because the 3 sisters in Onkuweweneha, Johekwa, they are our sustenance. Actually, the translation 3 sisters is kind of a curious English reinterpretation, but they are referred to as our sustenance because you can live off of those 3. They create a full spectrum diet. You literally can live off of corn, beans, and squash, and that is why they're so significant to Indigenous peoples on these lands and clear across the Americas. So we wanted to light a sacred fire, but in order to light a fire, you need a permit, and that permit process takes approximately 2 weeks. And now, in order to get a permit for a day, it costs, because you've actually done this process. It used to be like $200. Now it's gone up to $500 for a day. So a sacred fire is a process for grief. As an Onkwelonwe person, that's really important to us in the Gayanaragoa, the Great Law of Peace. The primary obstacle to peace is grief. And so if we don't have proper ceremonies, if we're not able to follow our cultural customs for dealing with grief, also not a wonder we should have such a volume of intergenerational grief, given the things that our peoples have endured, and also that we live in a ghost land of ecocide. So rather than go through that process, because if you have to wait 2 weeks just to get permission, plus you have to have $2,000 for 4 days, how many of our people can afford that? How many of our people are going to wait for their grief processes? Because 4-day commitment, that's 4 days and 4 nights straight. You can't walk away. You have to stay there and feed that fire, and it's a real process, and it's also so transformative when you are dealing with grief and loss, just to say. So trying to reconfigure, and I come back to what Kim was saying, actually trying to lift the barriers. And I think that that's actually one of the most important things that report put forward, is that barriers to self-determination of Indigenous peoples, but I would wage Indigenous relatives of all kinds, is the perpetuation of cultural genocide. Now that's their legal precedence. I think it's more than cultural genocide personally, because ecocide is not separate, but like when all the trees get erased, it impacts us as human people. When, the wetlands were erased, which they were, it impacts us as human people still to this day, because literally our water is not draining properly. I don't need to explain all of that, but just to say, because we were talking about what are we actually doing here on these lands, and I think about these processes of trying to re-indigenize these spaces, and in a park like Hyde Park that is just so heavily gentrified. And I know, because I've supported community under the veil of darkness to plant their placentas, to put out feast plates or spirit plates, to do all kinds of ceremonies, fires, singing to the land, etc. And we're always doing it like this because we've been literally thrown out of the park for doing our ceremonies. And even when we try to speak to the appropriate authorities, they brush it off like it's no big deal. And in fact, treat us like we're doing something wrong, which is honoring the land. Just simply that, or honoring our ancestors. We're actually doing a service, a debt of service to the spirits on these lands. You have to believe in spirits, of course, to see it that way. But in Hyde Park, Junction, Parkdale, they're low-income communities which are actually full of Indigenous people, because that's where they get pushed to. The Humber River, there are pockets of affluence and there are pockets of Indigenous communities where it's super low income, and they've never left. Indigenous people have never left those spaces, and they again continue to practice ceremony and have cultural connection to those lands, even if on the regular, daily stroll through those spaces you don't see them. And that's a really important thing for people to understand. Like, if you're not in those communities, you'd never know that, and you just think, Hyde Park, I never see Indigenous people there or anything about Indigenous people, so they mustn't be there. We're working on changing that.
On behalf of everybody here and our wonderful panelists, I'd like to thank you for an incredible discussion. Very refreshing. Thanks so much.